looked at one of the names of the Qur'an in the beginning of Surah Al-Baqarah, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the Qur'an as Al-Kitab, the book. And towards the end of our discussion yesterday, we alluded to one of the verses recited in the Isha Salah yesterday, wherein Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, شَهْرُ رَمَضَانَ الَّذِي أُنزِلَ فِيهِ الْقُرْآنِ. Let's look at that verse today, inshallah. Little bit of more information about that verse. Firstly, let's look at the name that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses for the Qur'an in this verse over here. In this verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the Qur'an as Qur'an. The name that you and I are familiar with, the name that we always use, Qur'an. What does the word Qur'an mean? What is Qur'an? Few possibilities, few possible meanings. Ulama explain, scholars of the Arabic language explain, that see this word Qur'an over here, this word Qur'an is derived from the word qira'ah. Qira'ah, to read. The Qur'an is something that is recited. The Qur'an is something that is read. That's why we call it Qur'an, because it's read. Other scholars say, actually, let's look at this word a little bit more. Let's look at this word a little bit more deeply. What we'll notice is that this word Qur'an, or the word qira'ah, is derived from three root letters, Qaf, Ra and Hamza. And whenever these root letters come together, these root letters indicate towards something being amassed. Disparate parts, very similar to what we said yesterday about Al-Kitab, disparate parts being put together. So for example, on a monthly cycle, the blood builds up in the uterine wall of the woman. This is referred to as Qur'un. And when that blood eventually comes out again, Qur'un. Right, so this is qira'ah. This is Qur'an, something that's made up of lots and lots of different parts, lots and lots of different verses, lots and lots of different chapters that are eventually recited, that eventually leave your inside, leave your heart and come out from your mouth. Qira'ah, Qur'an. Ulama say, or rather the scholars of Qira'ah say, that in fact the word Qur'an may be recited in two different ways. Some Qurra read it as Qur'an, others will recite it as Qur'an. See the difference? Qur'an, one with a Hamza, the other one Qur'an with no Hamza. What's the difference? Ulama say if we look at this particular usage of this particular name of the Qur'an, Qur'an, then the name of the Qur'an is derived from the root letters Qaf, Ra, Nun. Qarana. Qarana is to connect. Qarana is to join. Again, same meaning. Qur'an or Qur'an, something that joins together, that's made up by connecting lots and lots of different verses, lots and lots of different chapters. And again, ulama explain, look a little bit deeper, one of the other words, one of the other meanings that are derived from the same root letter, these same root letters of Qaf, Ra, and Nun, the word qarina. Qarina, depending on the context that we use it in, can be translated in different ways. But for now, let's translate it as a support. Qarina, some kind of supporting evidence. So what's the Qur'an? What's the Qur'an? Qur'an is that which is made up of many verses, each of which support one another. Many different themes, many different topics, many different ideas, all of which bolster one another. All of which lend more and more support, more and more credibility to each other. That's Qur'an. Now let's look at this verse over here. شهر رمضان الذي أنزل فيه القرآن. Ulama say, scholars of Tafsīr say that in this ayat, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala isn't telling us that the Qur'an was revealed in the month of Ramadan. That's not the objective of the ayat. The objective of the ayat, the purpose of the ayat over here is to tell us about fasting. But by the way, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions not just any month, but شهر رمضان الذي أنزل فيه القرآن. You know, it's like someone is listening to the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is speaking, it's like someone is asking a question. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is preempting that question. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is answering that question before it may even be asked. It's like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, شهر رمضان, fast in the month of Ramadan. Now you're thinking to yourself, okay, I must fast, but why must I fast in the month of Ramadan? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells you, unzila fihi al-Qur'an. What sets the month of Ramadan apart? What makes this month of Ramadan so special? The fact that the Qur'an was revealed in it. What's the connection between Ramadan and Qur'an? Why Sawm and Qur'an come together? Different reasons. Mention a few reasons. Let's start off by explaining something basic. You and I know that we are the servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? But just look at it a little bit more holistically. What that means is that we are in a relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. On our side, a relationship of servitude. From Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's side, a relationship of lordship. Rububiyyat. From our side, ubudiyyat, servitude. From Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's side, rububiyyat, lordship. What's the dictates of this relationship? From Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's side, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us everything we need. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us our sustenance. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala placed us here to begin with. Everything that we need, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us. And from our side, our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we need to attempt to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We need to always try to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. How do we get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Worship. But you know, I know, we all know that at the end of the day, what are we? We are animals. We may be humans, we're just sophisticated animals. Human beings who have passions, human beings who have animals, who have desires, who have passions. So what happens? The more you try to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the more your human, your animalistic nature stands in the way. The more your innate nature prevents you from getting more and more close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So now, what happens? By means of fasting, you weaken your animal nature. Remember, if you feed that animal nature, you feed your desires will grow. But if you starve those desires, prevent those desires from getting what they want, then you eventually subdue them a little bit. That's what Sawm is, to subdue the desires so that you can get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now let's look at the revelation of the Qur'an. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, secluding himself from everyone, going up to the cave of Hira, taking with him a little bit of food, not too much of food, just a little bit of food to keep him going. No interaction with other people. In this time, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam distances himself from every form of human connection. Now the Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam becomes closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decides to send wahi to Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam. First connection between Qur'an and Sawm, between fasting and Sawm. Second relationship between the two. Ulama say, look, what's the purpose of ibadah? One of the objectives, one of the purposes of ibadah is for you and I to express gratitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? Now, what do we do in Hajj, for example? Hajj, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has prescribed upon us so that we may remember the sacrifices of our father Ibrahim alayhi salam, so that we may understand what is deen, and thereby so that we may be grateful for it. What is Ramadan? Ramadan, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks us to fast so that we may think about Qur'an. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes this ibadat of Sawm binding upon us so that we may be appreciative of this gift that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has bestowed upon us, which is wahi, which is Qur'an. Third relationship, very briefly, what is wahi? What is Qur'an? Qur'an is the strongest form of the relationship that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has with his insan. The Qur'an is the strongest, the pinnacle of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's relationship with human beings. And what is Sawm? Sawm is the pinnacle of our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. From all the forms of ibadat, that form of worship that is solely and purely for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's sake, Sawm. And lastly, fourth connection that we'll mention, and we'll terminate here. What is Sawm? What is Qur'an? Sawm is supposed to make the taheer of our hearts, supposed to cleanse and purify our hearts. And what is Qur'an? Qur'an is there to cleanse and purify our hearts. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to utilize this month of Ramadan, to utilize our Sawm, our fasting, and to utilize our recitation of the Qur'an Kareem to cleanse our hearts from all forms of illness and to draw closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Wa akhiru da'wana and alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.